interpretations, the original painting by Velázquez, of course, and the interpretations by Picasso and Goya, because there we have the threshold position of the courtier. And the courtier in all three interpretations of the same painting is quite a central figure. And this particular position allows him an overview of the scene in the studio. In the Velázquez painting, the courtier's position is ambiguous in that he may be stepping into the room or leaving. In the Picasso interpretation, however, the feet are firmly placed on the ground. So he's like a barrier between the space in front and the space behind him. In Goya's etching, the courtier is only very vaguely visible in the distance. Now, this threshold position, as I said earlier, allows us as teachers to gain an overview, but on the other hand, also looking back and reflecting on what we are doing and what we have done. So Bakhtin would say, he acknowledges the wisdom on both sides of the teacher's desks and routinely seeks opportunities to mine that wisdom through mutually empowering discourse. The threshold paradigm acknowledges the fact that I consider myself in answerable relation with another. I am I for another, as Bakhtin teaches us. Placing ourselves on the threshold allows us to reflect on aspects on individual meaning of being. We are no longer the figure which operates in a largely epistemologically driven space, alienated from practice. By placing ourselves within the I-other relationship, with our students, we ground ourselves in, as Bakhtin terms it, the answerable deed. But this relationship between the self and the other does not take place in a vacuum. The human act or deed, rather than the word, is the paradigmatic act of authoring the self and the other, and is an analogy to divine authoring. And I quote Bakhtin here, "The architectonic of the deeds has three moments or aspects. I for myself, another for me, and I for another. The funnel paradigm is an I for myself stance, pretending to be I for another. Whereas in the Pali paradigm, we always see and know others only in relations to ourselves, never as that person would know him or herself. Now, threshold is another for me, so the dialogue that is taking place in the threshold paradigm allows us perceptual experiments, and it allows us the condition of perpetual beginnings and continuous renewal. It is a very helpful thought which has become part of the current discourse in education to think about potentiality, and I go with Rogoff's ideas on this particular concept. And I believe that this concept of potentiality plays an important role in threshold teaching. Rogoff defines it as latent capacity for growth, development or developing, coming into existence. Potentiality itself is an old idea. It follows Aristotelian argument, and it is the opposite of actuality, so that it inhabits the realm of the possible without prescribing it as a plan. Terms such as potentiality, actualization, and access are the building blocks and navigational vectors for a current pedagogy. A pedagogy at peace with its partiality, a pedagogy not preoccupied with succeeding but with trying. We need to also move away from notions of immanent meanings that can be investigated, exposed, and made obvious. Instead, practice can spur one on, not because it is self-consciously informed, but because it gives itself a different set of permission. Permission to cover all the bases all the time. Permission to start in the middle, permission to mix fact and fiction, permission to invent languages, permission not to support every claim by the proof of some prior knowledge, permission to privilege subjectivity as a mode of engaging the world and its woes. Permission to be obscure and permission to chart a completely different path of how we got there at this very moment. It is this odd space, which I call the threshold and Rogoff calls the academy, and which is partly university and partly museum, partly theoretical and partly practice-based. A space in which it is unclear whether the materials or the subjects are what makes up its manifest. A mode of operating is emerging which insists that we can learn not just from doing, but also from being. And in this context, Rogoff comes full circle with Bakhtin. Now, I would like to say a few words about learning within this threshold context. I must add that the time frame of this paper is too brief to go into any detail, but this will actually be also published as an article, and aspects and ideas will be explored in more depth. So learning within the threshold paradigm, we have to, as I said earlier, include our students, and students have to become an organic part of their learning process. We have to consider that meaning is never produced in isolation or through isolating processes, but rather through intricate webs of connectedness. The fact that college courses, artworks, thematic exhibitions, and other fora dedicated to make culture manifest or work to reproduce them into view do not have immanent meanings, but function as fields of possibilities for different audiences in different cultural circumstances and wildly divergent moods to produce significances. And ultimately on the fact that in a reflective shift from the analytical to the performative function of observation and of participation, we can agree that meaning is not excavated for, but rather that it takes place in the present. To quote Rogoff, because we need to consider that we are dealing with the generation digital. The generation digital, the cognitive processes of the generation digital are increasingly equated with programs that could be performed by computers. And the success of efforts to account for human capacities, such as, for instance, memory or concept attainment, is ultimately deemed to coincide with the ability to simulate such capacities through computerized programs. And I'm quoting Corradi Fiumari here. I would like to conclude this brief paper by showing you a slide of the Civilization video game, a very popular video game. In the words of the designer of the game, if you have even a passing interest in strategy games, world history, or getting less sleep at night, you owe it to yourself to give civilization for a try. We as educators give civilization for a try, but we might not be prepared to lose sleep at night over it. Thank you very much for your attention.